The United States hit Venezuela with a large-scale strike early.
Operation PB's success was a brilliant deception.
Under Bukele's state of emergency, law enforcement have arrested more than 81,000 people. Solitary confinement awaits.
The only light you get is through this hole. They could be in here for 15 days, potentially. Alright, I'm ready to get out.
Okay. So, just a quick announcement and update of where I have been these last couple of months. Because if you haven't noticed, it's been a couple of months, if not closer to a year since my last upload. Basically, if you didn't know, I finished my master's degree, started a second one, and also moved to a different country. So I have been quite busy and haven't been able to work on a video in general, but this is my attempt. The other thing that you might notice is that this is not the poetry video that I have been hinting towards for a while. That video is still in production. I'm still writing it. It's quite an expansive video. And instead, I have produced this, a video on current affairs. With any video that is produced about ongoing events, this is probably going to be out of date by the time that it is actually online. I understand this, and at this point I have just accepted that that is just how it's going to be. Every single time I write this video, I end up having to add a new revision in order to add new background information or new developments in whatever story I am talking about. So I have just decided to put this video out, and hopefully this can serve as a snapshot of a specific moment in time.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over.
It is 1951, Guatemala, and Jacobo Arbenz is democratically elected as president. Only a couple years prior, Arbenz and a group of militant revolutionaries and student activists had taken down the authoritarian regime of dictator Jorge Ubico. Ubico had increased the intensity of the police state and increased general political repression. In 1944, the junta led by Arbenz was able to topple Ubico's government and open free, open, and democratic elections. First, Arevalo, a philosophy professor, was elected and created moderate social reform for the country. After Arevalo, Arbenz was elected and followed and continued a majority of Arevalo's reforms. Specifically, he proposed something known as Decreto 900 or Decreto 900, a land reform law. Basically, it redistributed unused land larger than 90 hectares to local peasants and workers, meanwhile compensating landowners. The decree was highly successful and popular among Guatemalans, creating a sense of dignity and pride for their nation. In addition, it increased agricultural output as all this unused territory was finally being put to work. The US was not happy at this. Specifically, the US-based United Fruit Company. See, the United Fruit Company was heavily involved with Manuel Estrada Cabrera, the dictator who had come before Jorge Ubico and had gotten a lot of political concessions in Guatemala. In addition to this, the United Fruit Company was one of the largest, if not the largest, land-owning corporations in the country at the time. This being said, when Decreto 900 was actually put in place, the United Fruit Company was one of the largest affected parties just due to the fact that they owned so much of the land in Guatemala at the time. So the company went directly to lobby the US government, eventually bringing in the involvement of the CIA themselves, convincing the CIA that Guatemala had been infiltrated by communists. Meanwhile, this is all going on. Anastasio Somoza, the leader of Nicaragua at the time, felt threatened by the pro-democracy movement that was happening in Guatemala. Specifically, since he was an authoritarian and a dictator, and had squashed several pro-democratic movements in Nicaragua, he faced that this pro-democracy culture and movement would eventually seep into his nation. In reaction to this, Somoza aligned himself with Guatemalan dissidents and anti-democratic movements in the country, hopefully in order to take down the revolutionary government. So, Somoza also went to the US on a diplomatic visit in order to bring in American involvement. And in a meeting with the then sitting President Harry Truman, Somoza said that he could, quote-unquote, clean up Guatemala. Truman took this proposal seriously, and with the CIA, the backing of the United Fruit Company, and the Nicaraguan regime, they went on to form Operation PB Fortune, with its main goal of taking down the Guatemalan democratic movement. Operation PB Fortune would continue over the years, with the US supplying Nicaragua both with intel and arms. However, in the midst of this, Harry Truman, in fear that Operation PB Fortune would become public knowledge, especially in the context of a decree of non-involvement that the US had signed in the context of Latin America, and having Operation PB Fortune going against the rest of the OAS nations, the US pulled out of the operation. However, right after this, Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected as US president, who was more hardlined against communism, which now the US government claimed that the Guatemalan government was, after the Guatemalan government had decriminalized the Communist Labor Party. So Eisenhower would again join the overthrowing operation, claiming that Guatemala being communist would be a direct threat to US national security. This established Operation PB Success, with the US now directly training Contra soldiers in Nicaragua. However, this was not enough. The Contra military was soundly defeated by the Guatemalan army. In defeat, the CIA turned towards a psychological campaign. Specifically, they spread anti-governmental leaflets and aired US-aligned footage all throughout the country. They also began sending threats to government officials and communist-aligned Guatemalan citizens. They sent coffins, nooses, non-functional bombs in order to intimidate them. E. Howard Hunt of the CIA specifically claimed that what we wanted to do was to have a terror campaign, to terrify Arbenz particularly, to terrify his troops, much like German Nazi Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland. This is to say that they were using Nazi tactics. Eventually, this was just too much for the Guatemalan people, and with the growing psychological campaign, the Guatemalan army refused to fight. They had been under months of intimidation. After unsuccessfully attempting to rally the Guatemalan population into fighting, Arbenz stepped down as president, and with this, swiftly ending the pro-democracy movement in Guatemala, followed by the Guatemalan Civil War and a series of US-aligned dictators. Castillo Armas took over Arbenz's government, and in his first decree executed 3,000 to 5,000 Advance supporters. This is one of many stories of US involvement in Latin America. The continent is deeply scarred by this type of US interference. You can look at my past video on Salvador Allende for a great example on the lasting scars that this leaves. The Guatemalan Civil War lasted almost 40 years, ending in thousands dead, and 93% of all war crimes committed throughout the Civil War being committed by the US-backed military, eventually leading up to a genocide of the Mayan people. The death tally rounds up to around 1,062,000, with 130,000 being of Mayan descent, in what is normally referred to as el Holocausto Silencioso. The scars of the Guatemalan coup and the civil war that came after are not only just felt in Guatemala, but in the continent at large. So if you are watching this video, you might be wondering why I am talking about this. If you are living under a rock, then it might come as a surprise that the US has continued this type of violent involvement and continues to commit atrocities. Today, we are face to face with several of these atrocities, specifically the ongoing deportations under the Trump government and the US kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over.
So I will continue with another story. The name Kilmar Abrego Garcia might sound familiar. His story was widely publicized after he was illegally deported to El Salvador. In essence, he had migrated to the US following several threats of gang violence in El Salvador, gaining a partial green card that would stop the US from deporting him back to El Salvador, and deporting him would put him in feasible danger. He was living in Maryland with his American wife and his children. However, he was illegally kidnapped by ICE officials and deported to El Salvador on suspicion of being an MS-13 gang member, a claim that has been heavily disproven. Specifically, he was deported to psyop, or El Centro de Contenimiento contra el Terrorismo. Currently, El Salvador, governed by US-aligned Nayib Bukele, has entered into a deal with the US government, gaining $20,000 for each inmate it takes into the country. In addition, Nayib Bukele has proposed to use 10,000 inmates for the Cero Ocio program, utilizing psyop as an unpaid work camp for public infrastructure. This is meanwhile psyop has been heavily reported to be committing several human rights violations, with the BBC, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch all claiming that they have gone against human rights. This was the prison that Kilmar Abrego Garcia was illegally sent to. So, back to the story. When this story broke to the news and was heavily reported on, Maryland courts ordered both ICE and El Salvador to return Abrego Garcia to the US. ICE, even to this day, holds on to the position that Kilmar Abrego Garcia was an MS-13 gang member. When Bukele was asked about the return of Kilmar to the US in a trip to the Oval Office, he replied that he would not smuggle a terrorist into the United States. When district courts ordered for an expedited recovery, the United States government claimed that there were state secrets, refusing orders to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia to the United States. Finally, on June 6th of last year, Kilmar Abrego Garcia was returned to the US, claiming that this was all a quote-unquote administrative error. However, Tennessee courts have indicted Abrego Garcia for quote-unquote conspiracy to unlawfully transport illegal aliens for financial gain, and unlawful transportation of illegal aliens for financial gain. In response to this, Gilmar Abrego Garcia has been kept in a holding facility in fear that if he steps out, he will again be detained by ICE, especially since ICE continues to report that Gilmar Abrego Garcia is an MS-13 member, a claim that has been disproven. In the original writing of this essay, that is where I left this story. But in the subsequent months, Gilmar Abrego Garcia was released and was taken again into ICE custody. The fact that really still shocks me to this day, as reported by the LA Times, is that 90% of all migrants that were sent to El Salvador lacked a criminal record. These people are not put into detention because they have hurt anyone, have a known history of hurting people, or have a criminal record, but instead it is because of their origin. They are put into detention because of ethnicity or political status. With ICE raids continuing, we have seen more and more cases of legal US citizens being taken into custody. In addition to this, in a document that was filed by the Maryland courts, it claims that Gilmar Abrego Garcia was subjected to several beatings while in ICE custody. He was subjected to severe beatings, severe sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, and psychological torture. These are not just migration camps where people are kept to be sent back home, but they are concentration camps, torture camps, where people have been violently beat, put into inhuman conditions, and put under heavy psychological torture. CICOT specifically has refused investigations into its human rights abuses and has refused investigations from journalists except if they are aligned with Nayib Bukele's government. Latin America has always been seen as the backyard of the United States, being framed only in the economic benefit that it can provide. Nothing but a resource to be utilized and drained by the global north. Even the people are seen as resources, less than human. And when their lands are drained, when their territories are exploited, and there is nothing left for the people who live there, they are punished for seeking comfort and making a life for themselves in the center of empire, to seek better lives than those that you could find in the exploited Latin America. The Cito Ocio program can be seen through the line of this exploitation, offering unpaid labor in the public sector when people have been dehumanized past any recognition. This concern can also be brought up with for-profit migration detention centers, like those ran by GEO Group, one of the largest for-profit prison corporations in the US. According to a report by the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, it recalls the still ongoing Menocal versus the GEO Group Incorporated lawsuit regarding the unpaid work that was drawn from migrants being held in a migrant detention facility, which to this day has not been completed. This is mostly through the use of the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery except in the case of those who are imprisoned. A practice that has been used to draw unpaid labor from an incarcerated population, which is mostly black and brown. It was even proposed by Sentient Media that it is very likely, considering that ICE has been in discussions with for-profit prisons and industries, that detained immigrants might be used for 13th Amendment-style labor. This is specifically poignant considering Trump's government has been very lenient with ICE kidnappings, and this does not seem like something out of line in what has been done.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over.
There's a book that I adore by Eduardo Galeano the open veins of Latin America. Basically, what this book does is describe the history of exploitation of the Latin American continent in relation to first Europe at large and then the United States. How it's been exploited, drained of its resources, violently repressed, and then have self-sustaining modes of violence in place. What I find most interesting about this book is what it has to say about the Monroe Doctrine, especially within the context of the Cold War, considering that this book was written as a response to the coup d'etat that toppled Allende's government, being US-backed. If you didn't know, the Monroe Doctrine was a foreign affairs doctrine that the US had, basically stating that any country that would move towards communism would be a threat to national security and the international order. So, in response, the US would do anything in its power in order to stop communists from gaining any form of power within the countries around the world, but especially in Latin America, or topple any government that had shifted towards any semblance of communism. In traditional media, the Monroe Doctrine discusses communists or the left in general as a moral corruption, edging on the supernatural, that they have been corrupted spiritually. Having this said, when discussing the Monroe Doctrine, it is normally spoken about in terms of foreign affairs, of international relations. That is the language in which we understand the Monroe Doctrine. However, I find that this is an error, or at least there is a more apt way of discussing this. If we look at the example of Guatemala, the catalyst for the toppling of the Guatemalan government was economic interests in the area. While we talk about Monroe Doctrine and the corruption of communism as a moral and ethical failure, what is most prevalent and what this book very clearly discusses is that this form of interventionism, this form of violence, is normally through the lens of economics, of resources, of money. In Guatemala, it was the United Fruit Company that rang the bell around Guatemala's new democratic government. It wasn't just a moral corruption, a spiritual ill that had infected the country, but instead it was that they had lost US interests in that area through an economic lens. It is money that serves as the justification. In that same line, I fear that this is the same theory that has led a lot of the immigration raids around the US in this very moment. Firstly, we might have to disassemble some of the justifications that they pose towards the ICE raids. Firstly, migrant crime is a categorical falsehood. The American Immigration Council states that there is no active increase in crime in terms of an increase in migrants, even undocumented ones, instead having a negative correlation, bringing down crime as migration has increased since the 1970s. Almost every single study that I have found on the subject has come to the conclusion that migrants don't have a link to an increase in crime. Furthermore, it normally comes to the conclusion that US citizens commit more crimes per capita than migrants. So there is no way of claiming that this is a crime issue, a security issue. Instead, I truly believe that most of the ICE raids, in addition to being guided by racist populist sentiments around the country, are guided by financial gain. The big beautiful bill that Donald Trump passed right around the time that he came into power has approved almost $170 billion over 4 years in ice raids and an additional $5 billion increase in the Bureau of Prisons. The United Fruit Company, or the industry that is most to gain from what is going on in the United States right now, is the prison industrial complex, the for-profit prison industry. As reported on by The Observer, more than 90% of those detained in ICE raids are locked up in private for-profit prisons run by two companies, the GEO Group and Core Civic, which donated millions to Trump's re-election campaign. Internal communications from GEO identify the administration's aggressive border policy as a key source of potential revenue growth this year. The CEO of the GEO Group, Brian Evans, specifically posits that the increase in ICE raids around the US possibly means a $400 million increase in revenue. In addition to this, Trump has overturned Joe Biden's decision to stop collaborating with for-profit prisons, meaning that, again, Trump has aligned himself deeply with the prison industrial complex and the for-profit prison industry. A lot of the motivation behind the ICE raids is white supremacy. That is true, but I would also like to highlight that there is a financial gain in this, especially considering that the GEO Group wants to use these people for industry, and CCOT, a holding facility, is also interested in using these prisoners for industry. Latin Americans locked in detention centers are seen as inferior. As reported on by ABC News recently, with the construction of Alligator Alcatraz, the conditions are referred to as inhumane. Sofia Vicara, the fiancée of an inmate in the holding facility, claims that it's like you're dead alive. In 2024, as reported by Reuters, Trump referred to migrants as animals. We also have the clip of Trump discussing Haitian migrants eating the dogs, eating the cats. These people are seen as outside of empire, in the periphery, and are hence treated as lesser, as subservient, as dangerous. I refer to the Guatemalan coup in order to draw a parallel between the ongoing ICE raids and Latin America's want for self-determination.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over.
So I'm re-recording this because I don't believe I made my point well enough here. The United States of America has always aimed the gun of violence towards the Latin American continent. Chile, Cuba, Guatemala, Haiti, Venezuela, these are all nations that have been punished for seeking self-determination, especially seeking self-determination away from modes of violence that have been emplaced by empire. Firstly, by Europe, and currently by the United States. It is this form of violent interventionism which has left the Latin American continent scarred and with open veins. It is in this exact same moment, with the increase in ICE raids, that the gun has been turned toward itself. The interventionism that was normally pointed towards Latin America is being aimed into the United States, a sort of auto-interventionism. Of course, America has always aimed violence towards itself. It only takes a glance at Black history in the United States of subjugation, violence, lynchings, to see that this is not a new phenomenon. However, in attempting to understand the form of interventionism in the global South through the economic lens, I believe truly that you can use the same lens to understand the current ICE raids. It is the same kind of economic exploitation alongside white supremacy that is the North Star. Even when those living in America's backyard try to get into the house, the center of empire, they are still punished and treated as lesser and thrown into exploitation. That is the point that I'm trying to make here. We discuss our contemporary as unprecedented times, that Trump, Gilmar Abrego Garcia, Seacott, and all that is going on right now is a aspect of something unique in our current day and age. I talk about the history of US interventionism, whether that be in Guatemala or in Chile, in order to dissolve this myth. The things occurring today towards migrants and the global South at large are part of a series of repeated abuses that the US has committed. These are the times that we live in, not unique, but historically represented. It is easier to digest the fact that the current evils are unique, that there is something specifically evil about today in an otherwise clean history. Looking back though, we can see the violence that the United States has historically engaged in. And in addition to holding the United States accountable for the violence that it is doing today in our contemporary, we also have to be aware about the violence that it has committed in the past and hold them accountable to this evil.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over.
So that was where I was originally going to leave off this video. However, you might be wondering when I am going to talk about the ongoing events. There's two major stories that have occurred while writing this essay that are important to mention. On the 3rd of January of 2026, the dawn of the new year, the United States invaded Venezuela and kidnapped the then sitting president Nicolás Maduro. Now, I must mention, because it is going to come up, I am not a strong supporter of Maduro's government. I have a lot of particular issues with Maduro's government, and I will leave a more nuanced explanation in the description, but regardless, it is important to mention this. In essence, I am very much against Maduro's anti-democratic behavior, especially around the meddling that was done during his election and not allowing opposition leaders to run. In addition, there are massive amounts of human rights violations in Venezuela that were committed under Maduro's presidency. However, we also have to be aware that a lot of these claims of human rights violations have come from the US-dominated OAS, following the tomas of resources controlled by international corporations. This is in addition to the embargoes that were placed on Venezuela, following the nationalization of said resources under the Chavez government. One cannot understand the violence that was committed by Maduro's government without also being aware of the violence and economic repression that was done by the US. One does not take away from the other. There is a lot of nuance to this subject, and it would be bad practice to not discuss it. What I am attempting to point out, though, is the amount of US interventionism that we have seen, and how the human rights violations have been weaponized as justification for this type of interventionism, especially considering the United States has been so quick to disregard human rights, both in Gaza and, more aptly, in its invasion of Venezuela. So to go back to the story, the US military invaded Venezuela in order to capture the then sitting president Nicolás Maduro. The justification for this attack, or at least what was offered to us, were charges of narco-trafficking, especially narco-trafficking into the United States. However, before the actual invasion, the US had bombed a ship, which they also claimed was narco-trafficking, but what then was later revealed to be a fishing vessel that only held Venezuelan fishermen. Furthermore, the incoming narcotics into the US have not been affected by military action. This is to say that what the US has done, especially towards stopping narcotic trafficking as they have used as a justification for Venezuela's invasion, is an absolute failure. According to Julie Marie Brunk and Michael Ross Fowler in Bribes, Bullets, and Intimidation, they specifically point out that even countries with high secure borders and economic stability, like Costa Rica, don't have a statistical change in drug smuggling operations. Moreover, heightening border control and violent narcotic control seems to have an opposite reaction with drug smuggling, heightening smuggling operations. In addition to this, even if you buy the claim that the US's invasion into Venezuela is grounded in truth, the drugs that are being produced in Venezuela are not smuggled towards the US. They are mostly sent towards Europe. According to Christopher Fernandez Roy on NBC News, fentanyl, the drug that the US government claims that it's fighting against, comes mostly through the Mexican border, not out of Venezuela. Finally, we all know why it was done. I also awoke that morning and sat down to watch Trump's speech regarding the invasion of Venezuela. And one thing was very clear. This was about natural resources. This was about oil. We are offered the drug excuse, but it falls apart upon the tiniest bit of scrutiny. Following the invasion of Venezuela and in the speech, Trump specifically kept talking about the economic benefit that this invasion was going to bring both Venezuelans and the US, that it would make Venezuela very rich. He also pointed towards reversing the greatest theft of US property in history, the taking back of Venezuelans' natural oil reserves. Much like the United Fruits Company's justification of overthrowing the democratic government in Guatemala, the motivation for this overthrow of government, this regime change, is natural resources. It is oil. Trump's fixation on natural resources is no secret, especially considering the recent developments that have happened in terms of his interest in overtaking Greenland for national security, especially considering that Greenland is very rich in natural mineral deposits. This is, again, another example of how the US is draining the veins of Latin America. I personally felt very paralyzed at the news. As I've stated before, am not a Maduro supporter. I have very little love for Maduro's government, but it does show that there is a continuation of this style of violent interventionism. I have been writing this piece for a long time, and this served as justification. I could not continue having this piece unmade because these things were happening. And not just happening in the background, but happening right before our eyes. Another story that might seem obvious and very important to discuss in this moment are the ongoing ICE raids in Minnesota. After Nick Shirley's strange documentary regarding Somali fraud in the city, there was a massive increase in ICE raids throughout the country. This has caused massive violence towards migrants and people who are just seen as looking like migrants, with families being violently separated. And In addition, the recent public executions of 2 local Minneapolis citizens. Renee Good was violently executed by an ICE official for attempting to block an ICE patrol with her car. This sparked massive outrage and ongoing protests as of recording this video. Even more recently, in said protests, Alex Jeffrey Preddy was also violently executed for merely recording ICE officials. He was shot 8 times while being restrained by 6 ICE officials. This is an ongoing story, and recording this, I fear that this is only the start. I urge you, dear viewer, to hopefully do your own research.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking.
I don't really want to leave on a negative note. It's very obvious to leave on said note, considering both historically what has happened and what is happening currently. But what I have seen, at least in Minneapolis and around the US at large, even here in Europe, in regards to US interventionism when it comes to Greenland or other forms of injustices, we have organized, we have mobilized. There have been victories. The New Humanitarian has an article titled "How Latin American Countries Should Counter Trump's Migration Crackdown." It proposes building coalitions to fight American influence in the area and promote Latin American self-determination away from American influence and interference. I also want to leave with a note from Galeano's book, specifically on rebellion and memory. In his book, Galeano claims that all memory is subversive. He claims that empire tends to rewrite history, to sanitize the violence committed in maintaining its power. Keeping these stories alive, those of the violence committed, telling them and not allowing for history to be written over, is revolutionary in itself. To wrap this up, I would like to leave you a poem by Eduardo Galeano that continues to resonate today. I'll read it out in Spanish, but I will offer English translations on screen. Los emigrantes ahora, de Eduardo Galeano. Desde siempre las mariposas y las golondrinas y los flamencos vuelan huyendo del frío, año tras año. Y nadan las ballenas en busca de otra mar, y los salmones y las truchas en busca de sus ríos. Ellos viajan miles de leguas por los libres caminos del aire y el agua. No son libres, en cambio, los caminos del éxodo humano. En inmensas caravanas marchan los fugitivos de la vida imposible. Viajan desde el sur hacia el norte y desde el sol naciente hacia el poniente. Les han robado su lugar en el mundo, han sido despojados de sus trabajos y sus tierras. Muchos huyen de las guerras, pero muchos más huyen de los salarios exterminados y de los suelos arrasados. Los náufragos de la globalización peregrinan inventando caminos, queriendo casa, golpeando puertas. Las puertas que se abren mágicamente al paso del dinero se cierran en sus narices. Algunos consiguen colarse, otros son cadáveres que la mar entrega a las orillas prohibidas, o cuerpos sin nombres que yacen bajo tierra, en el otro mundo, a donde querían llegar.